How big is the DeCavalcante crime family compared to like the 5 families of New York?
Okay, so back then, they were known as the Sixth Family. And they were kind of known as like a farm team, not my words, but their words back then, a farm team to the Gambino family. They were closely aligned to the Gambino family back then. So they were a smaller family, but they were a very profitable family. And we can get into all that, how they made their money, but that's what they were aligned back then. So Anthony decides to cooperate. I immediately call the assistant. She's very concerned as to what I might have said to the attorney because I'm a new agent. And in these situations, less is more. So I just told the attorney that I would speak to you. And then we start what is called as a proffer session, where we get in, and it's known as a queen for a day, where it is the government's represented by an attorney, agents, myself, and on the defense side, it's a defense attorney and the witness or potential witness, the actual defendant. In this particular proffer, like what happens is it's very dicey, right? In the sense is you're removing a defendant from prison, and the defendant really has to be willing to come forward and admit all his crimes, right? So there's that trust factor, and you have a limited amount of time to actually do this, because you can't be away from prison for hours or for days because the bad guys are going to know, right? So we have a proffer. In that proffer it's Maria Barton, the assistant from the Southern District, George Hanna, the legendary agent that I had mentioned before, Kenny McCabe, a legendary Southern District investigator, and myself. And then there's Anthony Capo and his lawyer. So the first things that he tells us is, and even before we get to that, from a government perspective, what we want to do is make him eat the indictment. What I mean by that is we want him to admit his role in the crimes that he's charged with, to make sure that we got it right in the crimes that he's charged with. He immediately does that, so we can check that box. In case this proffer goes sour, he can no longer get back on the stand later and refute that claim. So that's the first thing we did. Then,
but wait a minute. Let me stop you right there. From what I understand, a proffer agreement, once you say it in the proffer agreement setting, it can't be used against you later on as long as you're telling the truth. So if he admits to these crimes, but then later on he makes up some other stuff and you say, forget it, proffer's off the table, how can those things be used against him?
Right. You are absolutely correct. What I mean by that is, if say that it went south, right, and that he went to trial and he got on the stand and he tried to refute or try to go against those 2 crimes that he's admitted his role in. So say that he comes in and says, okay, yes, I was part of the conspiracy to murder Charlie Majuri, and then it went south, and then he went to trial and tried to get on the stand and say that he wasn't part of the conspiracy to murder Charlie Majuri, then I can get on the stand and say that he's lying. So that's how, but as long as he comes in and tells the truth, you are absolutely correct. We can't use his words against him. But there's also another example, right? In the sense is, say that there's a bank robbery, right? It doesn't prevent me from going to get the video from a bank robbery and seeing that he robbed the bank. So that's another example of that. So when he comes in, the 3 things that he tells us out of the gate, knowing, this is very powerful stuff that we know he's telling us the truth, is A, he wasn't home that day because there was a leak in the Southern District, meaning they knew we were coming. So when we went to go arrest those 39 people that day, a lot of people weren't home. That's the first thing. The second thing he tells us is that he was the driver in the murder of a victim called Fred Weiss. Fred Weiss was from Staten Island. He was a businessman who was killed on 9/11, horrible day of 1989. The reason that Fred Weiss was killed was because John Gotti thought he was cooperating. The reason that John Gotti thought he was cooperating was because a bunch of people were arrested in June of '89, and Fred Weiss made the mistake of switching lawyers. That's the only reason that he was killed. Pure paranoia on Gotti's part that he thought that he was cooperating. Fred Weiss was not cooperating. Now, Ed, you had mentioned there before about the relationship between the Gambinos and the DeCavalcantes. John D'Amato back then was very close to John Gotti. It became a race to kill Fred Weiss. Fred Weiss's murder is probably the most indictable mob murder ever. At least 15 people between those two families have been convicted or pled guilty to that murder. There's actually testimony that these guys between both families were seen surveilling each other, trying to get Fred Weiss's pattern. So that's the second thing that he tells us. The third thing that he tells us is that he is the shooter in the murder of John D'Amato. Now, John D'Amato was killed in 1991. The reason John D'Amato was killed, and he was the acting underboss. At that time, he was the acting boss of the DeCavalcante family. So Anthony Capo killed the acting boss of the DeCavalcante family. The reason he was killed is because John D'Amato's girlfriend comes to Anthony Capo and tells him that John D'Amato is taking her to sex clubs in New York City and having sex with men. To each his own, I don't care, but Anthony Capo says we can't have the leader of our organized crime family sleeping with men. So Anthony Capo reports this to his superiors, and they decide that he's got to go. Now, the second reason that he was killed is because he was also borrowing large amounts of money from other organized crime families and saying it was for the DeCavalcante family, and in reality, he was covering his sporting and gambling losses that he had incurred. So these are the first three things that he tells us during the proffer. So now he's exposed himself to a life sentence. He was facing 20 to 30 years initially, and now he's facing life. So we have to huddle and decide, is he telling us the truth? Obviously, we decide he's telling us the truth because he just exposed himself to a life sentence. So that's how the cooperation with Anthony starts.